Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Our top story tonight is about the persistence of Islamophobia in North America. A 20-year-old man killed 3 generations of a Muslim family in an Islamophobic attack in the city of London, Canada yesterday. London Police Superintendent Paul Waight said that the family was specifically targeted by the attacker because they were Muslim. He said the suspect was wearing body armor when he rammed his truck into them at an intersection. Waight said that the police may charge him with terrorism. The victims were Sayyid Afzal, his wife Madiha Salman, their 15-year-old daughter Yumna Afzal, and Sayyid Afzal's 74-year-old mother. Their 9-year-old son Faiz Afzal is in the hospital with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted that he was horrified and labeled the attack as Islamophobic. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford paid tribute to the family and also called the attack an expression of Islamophobia. London, Ontario Mayor Ed Holder ordered flags outside London City Hall to be lowered for 3 days of mourning. Mustafa Farooq, who heads the National Council of Canadian Muslims, said this was a terrorist attack on Canadian soil and should be treated as such. This was the worst attack on Muslims in Canada since 6 people were murdered in a Quebec City mosque in 2017. A masjid leader from London, Ontario will join us later today for a detailed conversation regarding these events. Keep watching Muslim Network News to catch the segment. A shadow government in Burma has pledged to address discrimination and human rights abuses against minority Rohingya Muslims. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken welcomed the pledge by the National Unity Government, or NUG. He called it an important signal to all those working for an inclusive, democratic future. Last week, the NUG called on Rohingyas to help overthrow the military government. It promised them citizenship in the future democratic state in exchange. The NUG is set up by ousted lawmakers from the Aung San Suu Kyi government. It has promised to repeal a 1982 law denying citizenship to Rohingya Muslims. While in power, Suu Kyi had defended the military's genocide of Rohingya in 2017, despite international criticisms. She argued that those acts were legitimate and targeted insurgents. Retrospectively, Rohingyas have no confidence that the NUG would restore their citizenship. They said that the group has not included any representative from their community. A new task force to combat human trafficking and smuggling operations is being launched by President Joe Biden's administration. The focus will be on Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Joint Task Force Alpha will involve federal prosecutors partnering with the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. The announcement was made during Vice President Kamala Harris's trip to the region this week. According to U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland, the DHS has rescued over 4,000 migrants abandoned by smugglers since October last year. The task force will consist of federal prosecutors from several districts and from the Justice Department's criminal and civil rights divisions. Working with their foreign counterparts, they will also be assisted by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. During a press conference in Guatemala addressing potential refugees, Harris said that the trek to the U.S.-Mexico border is dangerous. Her key message, do not come. Harris was greeted by protesters with signs reading, "Trump won," and "Go home." The Guatemalan president, Alejandro Giammattei, blamed the Biden administration for the spike in illegal immigration, particularly amongst children. The U.S. has been involved in Guatemalan politics since 1954, when the CIA staged a coup under President Eisenhower. This replaced democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. This resulted in the death of over 150,000 people and was done to protect the United Fruit Company, which the U.S. had interests in. The world's largest energy company is hiring banks for its first ever dollar-denominated bonds. Saudi Aramco is raising cash to help fund its commitment to pay out $75 billion in dividends. The offer will include 3 tranches of notes due in 3, 5, or 10 years. These Islamic bonds, called sukuk in Arabic, will comply with Islamic teachings that do not allow giving or receiving interests. Last year, the price of Brent crude plunged below $16 a barrel, the lowest since 1999. Brent is used to set the price of 2/3 of the world's internationally traded crude oil supplies. As a result, Aramco reduced its spending, cut jobs, and sold off its non-core assets. Since then, the price of oil has risen more than 4-fold to over $70 per barrel. Aramco's first quarter profits soared and its cash flow fell short of the $18.75 billion needed for the dividend that period. Aramco has hired more than 10 banks from across the globe to organize bond investor calls from Monday. American investigators have recovered millions of dollars in cryptocurrency from hackers whose attack led to fuel shortages on the East Coast last month. The attackers were paid by Colonial Pipeline for a ransomware attack they carried out on May 7th. United States Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco said a majority of the ransom paid to the dark side network was successfully recaptured. The exact amount taken from the hacker's wallet was not disclosed. Colonial Pipeline provides around 45% of the East Coast fuel. CEO Joseph Blount had authorized the company to give $4.4 million in Bitcoin to the hackers in exchange for keys to decrypt the network. Colonial Pipeline was forced to shut down its operations for several days after the attack. The FBI recommends against paying ransoms. The agency said that it encourages hackers to go after other victims, and the payment may be used for criminal activities. President Joe Biden said that he had strong reason to believe the hackers were living in Russia. However, he said he did not believe the Russian government was involved. The IRS announced yesterday that it has started sending letters to over 36 million eligible American families for the expanded child tax credit. The monthly payments are scheduled to begin in July. For the year 2021, the American Rescue Plan established the maximum enhanced credit as $3,600 for children below 6 years. Those between the ages of 6 and 17 are eligible for $3,000. Half of the money will be paid out between July and December. The rest will be given after the parents have filed their 2021 taxes. 80% of the families will receive their money via direct deposit. The rest will be sent paper checks or debit cards. Scientists and researchers have found staggering amounts of life in the subsurface of the Earth. Various estimates suggest it has twice the volume of oceans. It also says it is one of the biggest, oldest, and most diverse habitats on the planet. With the absence of sunlight for photosynthesis and a meager amount of organic carbon food, researchers are puzzled by how life survives down there. 2 papers published earlier this year seem to shed some light on how microbes survive in the dark. While nuclear fusion reactions from the sun provide energy to the surface, radioactive decay sustains life below. Scholars Sherwood Lollar, Lee Hung Lee, and Tullis Onsteit discovered that the water trapped in rocky places held not just large amounts of hydrogen, but also helium. This indicates that particles from the radioactive decay of elements like uranium and thorium were splitting water molecules. Marie Curie had called this process electrolysis without electrodes. This discovery makes extraterrestrial life in some form a possibility. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called the incoming coalition the greatest election fraud in the history of democracy. The accusation is reminiscent of his ally, former US President Donald Trump's false claim that last year's election was stolen from him. Israeli security services have warned of an escalation in violent discourse in the country. After 12 consecutive years of control, Netanyahu faces charges including breach of trust, accepting bribes, and fraud, which could lead him to prison. The coalition is united by the goal of removing Netanyahu from power. It is made up of 3 right-wing, 2 centrist, and 2 left-wing parties, as well as an Arab Islamic conservative party. Netanyahu based the allegations of election fraud on a broken election promise his potential successor, Naftali Bennett, had made. Bennett had pledged not to partner with left-wing, centrist, and Arab parties. However, the coalition is dependent on their support for success. Under the agreement, Bennett of the right-wing nationalist Yamina party would be premier for 2 years. He will then be replaced by centrist leader Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid party in 2023. They're called the First Nation in Canada. They're mourning their dead children found buried in unmarked graves of a residential school. How is the rest of Canada reacting to this news? More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Faruque.
Canada ran 139 schools for Canadian Native children. The goal was to civilize them and to convert them to Christianity. Schools were paid for by the Canadian government and run by Christian churches. Disconnected from their parents and culture, 150,000 children faced the horror of their lives. These horrors have come to revisit Canada with the discovery of 215 children buried in unmarked graves. The Canadian government has apologized. The Catholic Church refuses to do so. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is once again calling on the Catholic Church to apologize for its role. The Catholic Church ran that school from 1890 to 1969, where the children were found buried. The Catholic Church also ran 70% of all such residential schools. How many other children died in these schools? Were they tortured? Were they punished physically? The Catholic Church probably knows, but the Church refuses to open its historical record of its residential schools. The Archbishop of Toronto, Cardinal Thomas Collins, rejected the call for apologies. He says that a dramatic step, such as a formal apology from the Pope, is perhaps not the best route going forward. Unfortunately, even an apology cannot bring those children back. We will never be able to hear their stories, ever.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me, for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Earlier tonight, we shared the news about the Islamophobic attack in London, Canada. To learn more about this attack and how the Muslim community is reacting to this horrific hate crime, let's turn to Saleha Faruque, who is in talks with Imam al-Fatah Twakkal of the New London Mosque. Over to you, Saleha.
Thank you so much, Hena. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Imam al-Fatah Twakkal, who is an imam as well as director of outreach of the London Muslim Mosque. Imam, thank you so much for being here with us in light of the recent tragic events in your city.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Canadians across the province of Ontario and as well as across the country, but especially Canadian Muslims, are really struggling to come to terms with a mass murder that took place and took the lives of 4 Canadian Muslim family members. If I may ask, how are you doing? And from your perspective, how is the London community at large coming to terms with what had happened during this weekend?
So first we begin Bismillah, and we say Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal. You know, there's not a situation in which we do not turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, through darkness and through light, through good times and through bad times, through hardship and through ease. We always say Alhamdulillah. It definitely has been challenging. This is a matter that weighs heavily on our community. We're grieving, our hearts are broken, we feel the pain, but at the same time, we have a sense of resilience, and we also have a strong sense of resolve that, inshallah ta'ala, we will be able to get through this as a community. It will not be easy, but we always have our faith, our hope, and our reliance in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Thank you so much for that. Now, recently, according to Statistics Canada, in 2019, the police had actually estimated that an approximate 1,900 hate crimes in Canada had targeted Muslims. And in addition, their findings showed that these crimes targeting Muslims rose by approximately 10% from 2018. Now, as a community leader of a major Canadian city, being London, of course, what do you make about this figure?
So, I mean, we acknowledge and understand the reality of, you know, Islamophobia and incidences and crimes that are hate-based. This is a reality. And we see this happening, you know, across our country, and it is on the rise. And so, really, the task that is at hand and what it is that we need to do is to be able to focus on that aspect of it existing, Islamophobia as a reality, and then taking the appropriate means and actions in order to root this out. And this is not an effort that is exclusive to the Muslim community, but rather this has to be a collective effort of the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community of Canadian society at large, in order to be able to take concrete steps to root out all forms of discrimination, all forms of hatred and bigotry, xenophobia, Islamophobia, in order to be able to live as a society that every single member feels they're safe.
Thank you, Imam. Now, many people are reminded here about the recent 2020 killing of Mohammed Aslim Zafis in Toronto, as well as the 2017 massacre of 6 Quebec Muslims in the province of Quebec. How do these events serve as reminders of the importance of perhaps dismantling anti-Muslim racism as well as anti-Muslim discrimination?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the goal is want incidences that take place within any of our communities of this sort. And so those are stark reminders, and we mention those, you know, I mean, even with January 29th, for example, as being, you know, declared as a national day of remembrance of the Quebec mosque attack and action against Islamophobia. You know, these are events that we have to continue to bring to light, to remind our communities, Muslim and non-Muslim, that they exist, they're a reality, And now we have June the 6th, unfortunately, that is added onto that list. But the goal is that we no longer want to add any more dates based on these horrific incidences that take place within our community. But we use these as a reminder that we still have work that needs to be done, and we need to do this now. We need to do this work today and not to put it off until tomorrow. The words of support are great, but we need concrete actions that go beyond just words or promises. We actually need to put in place action plans that are concrete in stamping out or rooting out any form of hatred that exists within our society, whether it be online or whether it be within our communities, that we do have to take concrete steps and actions to say that we will not accept this any longer.
Now, many people around the world might actually have an idea of Canada being quite inclusive or multicultural, and we can't help but wonder and ask you, do you think that this is the case, given such a frequent, disturbing stream of crimes targeting Canadian Muslims as well as targeting racialized peoples in this country?
So there's no denying that, Canada as a beautiful country is something that it prides itself in its diversity. And this has been my experience, being born and raised in this country, that there is a lot of diversity that exists. But within the same breath, we say that there are elements that exist within Canadian society that can lead towards these types of egregious crimes, these attacks, these acts of terror that need to be dealt with. And so we cannot deny the existence of these elements that we see in our cities and online. But at the same time, we acknowledge that, Canada is a diverse country, and the majority of Canadians are peace-loving and law-abiding citizens, that they would not want this to happen to anyone. And that really has been a sentiment that every time these events they take place within our community, the outpouring of support that we receive from all different levels of within our society, from whether it's the politicians or whether it's the municipal officials or whether it's the police or whether it's the people, the general population, the outpouring of support and love that we receive is something that is extraordinary. And that is the Canada that I know. That is the Canada that I was raised in. And that is what gives me hope that we can continue to go in that direction as a society until enough people are able to say that we will not accept any form of hatred, racism, or bigotry, and that we take the steps to dismantle whatever forms of discrimination exist, including that which is systemic. And it's not to deny that there are not systemic issues of racism that exist, but the conversations are happening, and we need to build upon these conversations, and from these conversations allow concrete actions to emanate.
Now, during the course of this interview, you spoke a little bit about recommendations that you might have for change. If you can perhaps elaborate a little bit about calls to action that you might have for Canadian local as well as federal leadership, especially after this startling event, from your perspective as a community leader in London.
So there's no denying that these events, they take place and that they do not happen out of a vacuum. But there are factors that can contribute to how an individual would go to the extent to commit such an egregious act of terror against innocent people, and the hatred and the vitriol that exists within our society online, for example, that can easily lead to people justifying these actions and then even following through with them and actually doing that. And it's no surprise, unfortunately, that even after this event happened on June the 6th, that there are those fringe elements that exist within our societies that were actually praising the individual who did this, and they're coming from a very particular background in terms of white supremacist ideologies, and these are things that need to be outlawed in the sense that laws need to be put in place to ensure that anyone who espouses these views, regardless of what their background is, that they can be charged because they lead to these possible acts within our society, and they're not acceptable. And people are free to hold their views and their opinions, but they're not free to violate the rights of others.
Imam Abd Twakkal, who is an Imam as well as the Director of Outreach at the London Muslim Mosque. Imam, thank you so much for your leadership and your courage, and we wish you and your community strength and resilience during this difficult time.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha and Imam Twakkal. The news has shaken many of us to the core. We express our sincere condolences to the Muslim community in Canada and urge them to stay strong during these trying times. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's first national security advisor appeared to endorse a Burma-style coup in the United States. Later on social media, an account used by Flynn claimed his words had been twisted and he wasn't calling for a coup. To discuss the significance of this statement, let's go to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who's joining Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. On the Memorial Day weekend, General Michael Flynn, the retired general that is, he suggested in an answer about the military coup in Myanmar that yes, that may not be a bad idea for the US, in his words, something like that. Of course, later on, he says that he didn't quite mean it. But him being the former National Security Council leader and a retired general, and a whole lot of skepticism in the country about the election results. So there are many questions regarding that. And to explore those questions with us is Lawrence Wilkerson, who is a former chief of staff for the United States Secretary of State Colin Powell and a retired colonel in the US Army itself. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell us this. The Defense Secretary Austin issued an order for the military to stand down, and everyone takes time to think and discuss extremism in the military. Is there anything to worry about?
The episode that you just remarked on with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn is a case in point, to be sure. The real reason that I think the military leadership, who should go after General Flynn, and I mean throw the book at him, won't. And there are two fundamental reasons they won't, in addition to their lacking moral and political courage. Number one, there are a lot of people in the ranks of the U.S. military who agree with Lieutenant General Flynn. Could be as high as a third of the enlisted ranks and a considerable portion of the officer corps. So they're worried about that portion of the military that agrees with General Flynn. And then the second reason is that the all-volunteer force, the way America populates its military, is having trouble finding enough men and women to fill out the ranks. And many of the best recruitment pool for that military agree with General Flynn also. And so my Army in particular, but the armed forces in general, don't want to alienate anyone in that group when they might be potential recruits. Now, those two reasons bespeak of themselves a real problem for our country. But that's the truth of it, in my view.
The Myanmar military itself, or the Burmese military, has been in control and running the country on and off. First time surprised people in America know what Myanmar or Burma is and asking question, can that be done here? Isn't the General Flynn one of the person who suggested that martial law be imposed in favor of the President Trump?
Yes, and he's also the one who very, very surprisingly to those of us in the military who believe in the practice and protocol of the last century, that is to say that military officers, particularly general officers, flag officers, shouldn't speak out. So he's the one who stood on the stage, I believe it was the Republican convention, and said, lock her up, referring to the Democrat candidate, Hillary Clinton. And at that point, the leadership should have stepped in and rebuked him significantly, if not called him back to active duty and put him through the Unified Code of Military Justice court-martial system. The reason, as I said, they won't do that today, the reason that they refrain from doing that is they're afraid they'll stir up the masses within the military who agree with General Flynn.
Is there a precedent for the former commanders to be called back for the military? Don't you think it's only the active military people who could be tried in the military court?
No, that's a modern interpretation of the law that I simply don't agree with. And I dare say most of the people that I served with for my 31 years in the military don't agree with either. It's just a lack of political and moral courage. It's very easy for the Secretary of Defense to bring someone back to active duty, especially an officer, because an officer never really leaves duty. Give you an example. In the first Gulf War, when I was working for Colin Powell, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we actually called an 85-year-old boiler tender back to active duty. And he was 85 years old. His skills were not replicable. He was the only one who could do this. And he took a ship's boilers out of the James River fleet, and it made 2 transits to the Gulf with him as the boiler tender. So you're subject to recall at any time. As a matter of fact, in 2003, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld sent me a letter recalling me to active duty when I was Chief of Staff at the State Department. Colin Powell then asserted that I was critical personnel. I wanted to go. He asserted that I was critical personnel, and I did not have to answer that letter and come back to active duty because of that. But the Secretary of Defense can call any military officer back to active duty anytime he wants to.
Do you think, what is the impact? I mean, I see multiple things here. One is that a lot of people in the military are refusing to be vaccinated. And then there was news that 10% or so of the people who are involved in January resurrection at the Capitol Hill were themselves former military or veterans. So is there an impact of watching Fox News? Is Fox News has a special access to the military?
Fox News is predominantly the station that the military, especially the enlisted ranks of the military, watches. You can go on any military base in the United States, and in fact, overseas too, if they have the capability, and most of them do. And you'll see in the rooms where soldiers gather, sailors gather, and so forth, Fox News on. So yes, that's a part of it. But you also have what I call the third great awakening in America today. It's Christian nationalism in other people's terminology. But what we have is 100 million evangelicals in America, self-identified evangelicals. Amongst that 100 million, there are, I think, and some surveys support me in this, somewhere between 30 and 40 million fundamentalists. And when I say fundamentalists, I mean sects like the Dominionists, who have a motto: take over the armed forces for Jesus, take over the armed forces for God. That's their purpose. And we have a lot of them within the military ranks now, as I was mentioning before. So this is a widespread phenomenon that isn't going away anytime soon. And it is, in fact, dangerous for the armed forces to have so many of them within its ranks. But as I said before, the way we populate the military is voluntarism. And this is a group that volunteers readily for military service.
So what is the course of action Secretary of Defense Austin has to deal with this particular phenomenon?
He's tried from the very start of his secretariat. He let it be known that this sort of activity, as we saw at the Capitol on 6 January, should not take place, and it definitely should not be participated in by members of the military, veterans or active duty, National Guard or Reserve, anybody wearing a uniform or having worn a uniform. But it's easy to say it, it's difficult to implement it, particularly because of what I said earlier. You're going to alienate your most ripe, rich recruitment pool for new soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and so forth, if you take a real hard stance against this Christian nationalism, or for that matter, against some of the organizations that seem a lot like them, like the Oath Takers, the Proud Boys, the whole QAnon business, and so forth. This is very much a part of the military. We wonder today, we military professionals looking at it, just how big it is. Is it 20%? Is it 30%? Is it more? Because it's a very dangerous phenomenon.
What is your estimate? How many?
I think in the enlisted ranks, it may be as high as a third. And that's quite a few. If you look at those refusing to be vaccinated, you're looking at, whether you're looking at the Navy or the Army or the Marine Corps or whatever, you're looking at somewhere between 30 and 40%. I think that percentage corresponds pretty directly with the group of people we're talking about here. Not completely, but I think it's a good estimate. So it's quite a few. It's quite a few members of the military.
So if they're watching Fox TV most of the time, as you mentioned, it probably will have a unique impact. They're listening to certain information, but not the rest of the information. So are there any measures being taken to have a broader media available to the military personnel?
Well, that's a good question. There are other media sources available to the military. It would mean that you would have to take some very draconian action and go into places where televisions are, where troops are gathered. And you would have to say, turn on MSNBC or turn on CNN or turn on Al Jazeera or some other channel. I don't think the military is willing to do that. And I think they would get a lot of blowback from the troops were they to do that. After all, it's not the military's purpose to dictate to the troops what media sources they pay attention to. So I don't think that'll happen. That it should happen or that it ought to happen is another matter, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Colonel Wilkerson, you have been in different position in the government. If you are the Secretary of Defense, what are the three things which you do to transform the danger and the risk of our military interfering in a very difficult time in our democratic history?
I think that's a very important question. I hearken back to the 1930s in Weimar, Germany, especially after the Reichstag fire and Hitler's coming to power in 1933. And the leaders of the Wehrmacht, the German army, mostly Prussian, thought they could handle Hitler. The political parties, the Catholic Party, the Social Democrats, the Communist Party, all thought that they could handle Hitler. And indeed, all those parties combined won more seats than the Nazis did in those 33 elections. But they all were overcome. Hitler eliminated them all eventually and used the Wehrmacht, of course, and the rest of the German military machine to roll over Europe. So I'm not saying the situation is exactly the same, but it is so reminiscent of those days and fascism in general that one really needs to take action. So the first thing I would do is pick someone to make an example of, and Flynn stands out in that regard. I would call them back to active duty, and I would court-martial them to the full extent of the law. The second thing I would do is what Austin has already done, but I think I would be a little more adamant about it. I would let it be known to all the leaders, especially those flag officers who might be sympathetic with Flynn, that if I detected anything amongst them, about them, around them, or whatever, or amongst their troops that bespoke the same thing Flynn was doing, I'd remove them too, just the way I had taken action against Flynn. And then the third thing I would do is start a really service-wide education program. I would start a program that was strictly, it wouldn't come across Fox or MSNBC or CNN or anything else. It would come through the Army's channels. We used to call it command information. And it would be their leaders talking to them, if necessary, from a script prepared at Secretary of Defense's office. And it would be instruction as to what could happen to them if they got off base with regard to these matters. And on a more positive basis, what they should be doing to protect our democracy, to protect our republic. And I would even use the example of Weimar Germany and Hitler's ascension to power as an example of what can happen if militaries become lackadaisical about their responsibilities, about their ethics, and about their codes and law, and allow things to get out of hand. You need the military. The military is the instrument of force. And if you're going to pull off a coup, if you're going to take over the government, you need the military. Otherwise, the government's going to use the military against you. That's a truism of history, 5,000 years of human history. And people who tell me that the United States could not succumb to that impress me as being idiots.
Well, thank you so much, Colonel Wilkerson, for your time and wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid and Colonel Wilkerson. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube channel. Reach out to us on Facebook to give comments and feedback and catch the latest news covered by Muslim Network TV. This was Hena Zuberi, and you just watched Muslim Network TV's Daily News. Peace and blessings upon you all. Assalamu alaikum and good night.